The afternoon sun was bright, shining against the glass windows of a luxury car dealership. Inside, the cars gleamed like jewels, polished to perfection, each one placed carefully on the spotless showroom floor. The air smelled of leather seats and fresh polish. A place like this was built for serious customers, for people who wanted to show off wealth and success. That day, the heavy glass doors opened and in walked Big Shaq. His presence was hard to ignore. He wasn't dressed like the other customers who often came in with suits or designer clothes. Instead, he wore a simple hoodie, track pants and sneakers. His look was casual, relaxed, the kind of style that made him comfortable. But to the people inside the dealership, it made him stand out for the wrong reasons. Shaq walked with confidence, his head high, his eyes scanning the shiny cars lined up before him. He had dreamed of this moment for a long time. Buying a car wasn't just about luxury for him. It was about proving to himself that he had made it, that all his hard work and struggle had led him here. As he walked deeper into the showroom, a few employees looked up from their desks. At first, they didn't move, their eyes followed him, some of them smirking quietly. One whispered to another, "He doesn't look like he belongs here." The other chuckled, "Yeah, probably can't afford the tires, let alone the car." But Shaq ignored the stares. He had always been judged for how he looked. He had learned long ago not to let whispers slow him down. He kept his focus on the cars, his eyes lighting up when he saw a sleek black sports car near the center. He walked closer, running his hand gently along the hood, admiring the smooth surface. Finally, he approached a sales representative standing by a desk. He smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, I'd like to know more about this model." His voice was calm, respectful. The salesman barely looked up from his phone. His eyes glanced over Shaq's outfit and shoes before he shrugged. "That car's expensive, sir," he said with a smirk. "Maybe you'd like to check the economy section? We've got some used cars at the back." Shaq blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected warmth, but he also hadn't expected to be dismissed so quickly. "No," he replied firmly. "I came here for this one. I want to know the details." The salesman rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, "Waste of time." But before Shaq could say more, the manager of the dealership walked over. His sharp suit and slicked back hair gave him the look of someone who enjoyed power. He stopped in front of Shaq. Folding his arms across his chest, "Can I help you?" the manager asked, his tone carrying no respect. Shaq nodded, keeping his cool. "Yes. I'm interested in buying a car. I'd like to see the features. Maybe take one for a test drive." The manager's eyebrows raised slightly as if the words were unbelievable. He laughed quietly and shook his head. "Listen, we get people like you here all the time," he said. "Looking around, touching things, wasting time. If you don't have the money, don't bother." The word stung, but Shaq didn't show it. He simply stood taller, his eyes steady. "I didn't come here to waste anyone's time," he said calmly. "I came here to make a purchase," but the manager was already shaking his head. Waving to the salesman, "Don't bother showing him anything," he said loudly, loud enough for other customers nearby to hear. "This guy doesn't belong in a place like this." Some of the people standing nearby turned to look. A few frowned at the harsh words, but no one spoke up. Shaq felt their eyes on him, judging him the same way the manager was. His chest tightened. But he reminded himself he had faced worse. Instead of leaving, he walked slowly toward another car, a luxury SUV with shining rims. He bent down to look inside, admiring the leather seats. "This one too," he said, his voice firm. "I want to see this one." The manager stepped in front of him, blocking his view, his face hardened. His voice sharp. "I said enough," he snapped. "People like you come here to look, not to buy. Don't waste my time. Don't touch the cars." The disrespect was loud, public and humiliating. Shaq's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. But he didn't lash out. He had learned control. He had learned patience. He knew losing his temper would only make things worse. Instead, he looked the manager straight in the eye and said softly, "You don't know who I am." The manager smirked, stepping closer. "And I don't care," he said coldly. "If you don't leave on your own, I'll make you." The employees watched nervously. The customers whispered. The air in the showroom felt heavy with tension. And though Shaq stood tall, he knew this was only the beginning. The real test had just started, because he wasn't leaving, not yet. And what would happen next would not only change the dealership, but would shock everyone who thought they knew him. The tension inside the dealership grew heavier with each passing moment. Big Shaq had walked in with excitement, his mind filled with the thought of finally owning a luxury car. But instead of being treated like a customer, he was being treated like an intruder. The employees behind the counters exchanged glances. One of them whispered not quietly enough, "Why is he even here?" "Look at him, he's probably lost," another chuckled softly, pretending to cough to hide his laughter. Their eyes weren't curious, they were mocking. Shaq noticed, of course, he wasn't blind to the stares or the smirks. He had felt them many times before in other places. People looked at his hoodie, his sneakers, his casual style, and they judged without asking, without even knowing who he was. They built a whole story about him in their minds. He could have ignored it. But the way they looked at him wasn't just rude. It was dismissive, like he wasn't even worth their time. Still, Shaq kept his head high. He had come for a reason, and he wasn't going to let arrogance push him out so easily. He walked over to another car, a sleek silver coupe that sparkled under the showroom lights. He leaned forward to peek inside, imagining himself behind the wheel. For a moment his heart lifted, but then came the sharp voice of the manager. "Didn't I tell you not to touch the cars?" The manager snapped. His tone carried no professionalism, no courtesy, only contempt. His words rang across the showroom, loud enough for everyone to hear. Customers nearby turned their heads, watching as though it were a scene playing out in a movie. Shaq straightened up, his eyes calm. "I didn't damage anything," he said softly. "I'm just looking. I came here to buy, not to waste time." The manager scoffed, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "Buy? These cars cost more than your yearly rent. You think this place is some kind of museum? This is for real buyers, not dreamers." The words hit hard, not because Shaq doubted himself, but because they revealed the man's arrogance so clearly. The dealership wasn't just refusing him service, they were insulting his very presence. Shaq tried again, his voice polite but firm. "I came here with serious intentions. I've worked hard for this. I want to see the details, and I'm willing to pay for what I like." But the employees only laughed quietly among themselves. The manager waved his hand dismissively. "Listen, let me make this easy for you. The cheapest car in the showroom is already out of your reach. Don't embarrass yourself." The words "don't embarrass yourself" echoed. Each syllable felt like a slap meant to shrink him down. Other customers inside shifted uncomfortably. Some frowned at the rudeness, some whispered, "That's unprofessional." But none stepped forward to defend Shaq. The unspoken rule of luxury spaces seemed to linger. If you didn't look like you belonged, you were treated like you didn't. The manager leaned closer, lowering his voice but making sure it was still sharp. "If you know what's good for you, you'll turn around and leave quietly. I won't call security yet, but don't push your luck." Shaq's chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. His patience was being tested, his dignity challenged. He could feel the burn of anger rising inside, but he didn't let it spill over. Instead, he kept his voice level, steady. "You don't know me. You don't know what I can afford. You don't know why I'm here." The manager laughed, shaking his head as if Shaq's words were a joke. "Oh, I know enough," he sneered. "I know you're wasting my time. I know you're playing pretend. And I know one thing for sure, you're not driving any car out of here." The employees nearby smirked. One even pretended to type on his computer, whispering to another, "Should I check if he wants a bicycle instead?" They both laughed quietly. Shaq clenched his fists behind his back. His pride told him to walk out, to leave them with their arrogance. But his determination told him to stay, to show them that respect wasn't something you begged for. It was something you demanded with dignity. He stepped closer to the manager, his eyes steady. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. His voice carried no threat, just certainty. "You'll regret the way you're treating me." The manager rolled his eyes, unimpressed. "Regret?" he scoffed. "The only regret I have is letting you inside this place. You're lowering the standard of my showroom." That final line stung the air. People around gasped softly. Some customers began recording quietly on their phones. They could sense something was about to happen, something that would escalate beyond just words, and they were right. Because the dismissive attitude wasn't going to stop with words. It was already growing into something uglier, something that would soon cross every line of respect. Shaq stayed rooted in place, his calm presence the only thing keeping the situation from boiling over. But deep down, he knew this was far from the end. The manager wasn't finished. He had more arrogance to spill, and soon, He would take it further than anyone in that room expected. And when he did, the entire dealership would learn a lesson they would never forget. The air inside the dealership was thick. Every word the manager spoke dripped with arrogance, and every step Big Shaq took seemed to test his patience. Customers stood back, pretending to browse cars, but their eyes never left the unfolding scene. Some clutched their phones, holding them low, recording quietly, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. The manager, chest puffed out, strutted around like he owned not just the showroom, but the very people inside it. His voice carried loudly, sharp enough for everyone to hear. This is what happens when we let just anyone walk through those doors. They think they belong here, touching cars worth more than their lives. He laughed bitterly, and a few of his employees chuckled nervously. Though their eyes betrayed discomfort, Shaq stood still, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to this kind of public humiliation, but he knew walking out without a word would only feed the arrogance of the man standing before him. Still, he chose restraint, his calm presence clashing against the storm of insults. "Why are you treating me like this?" Shaq asked finally, his voice firm, steady. The tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. It was the kind of voice that made people pause. "I came here like any other customer. I came to buy." The manager laughed so loudly that the sound echoed across the showroom. "Buy?" he mocked. "With what? Loose change in your pocket?" He took a step closer, his finger pointing toward Shaq's chest. "You don't belong here, not in this showroom, not near these cars. Not even on this floor." The words cut deep. But they weren't just for Shaq. They were said for the crowd. The manager wanted an audience. He wanted to make a spectacle of this moment, to flex his authority in front of employees and customers alike. Shaq's fists tightened at his sides, but he stayed rooted, his eyes locked onto the manager's. Calm but unflinching. "You don't know me," he said softly. "You don't know what I'm capable of," the manager sneered. Leaning in close, his voice now a whisper meant only for Shaq, though the venom in it carried far. "I don't need to know you. I can smell people like you from a mile away, dreamers, pretenders, the type who walk into places they can't afford and beg for attention." Shaq's eyes narrowed. His heart pounded, but still he didn't move. He had always believed that real strength wasn't in fists, but in composure. Still, his silence only emboldened the manager further. He turned dramatically to the watching crowd, his hands outstretched. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with mock formality, "here we have someone who thinks he can waltz in, point at a car worth 6 figures and drive it home like it's nothing. Tell me, does he look like a buyer to you?" A few people murmured uncomfortably. Some shook their heads in disapproval, not of Shaq but of the manager's cruelty. Others stayed quiet, unwilling to get involved. Their silence gave the manager even more confidence. Shaq felt the sting of humiliation rise in his chest. The entire dealership now stared at him like a performer on stage. But instead of shrinking, he stood taller, his calm presence cutting through the noise. "I didn't come here for a performance," Shaq said, his voice deeper now. "I came here to buy. You've already judged me, insulted me, humiliated me. Do you feel powerful now?" The manager smirked. "Powerful? No, this isn't about power. This is about keeping people like you out of spaces you don't belong in. And if you think I'm done, you're wrong." With those words, he took a deliberate step forward and shoved Shaq backward. The crowd gasped, a sharp intake of air filling the room. Phones rose higher, recording now in plain sight. The employees froze, their eyes wide. Knowing this had gone too far, Shaq stumbled back but didn't fall. He straightened himself quickly, his broad shoulders firm. His eyes locked onto the manager with a steady, unshaken gaze. For a split second, it seemed like he might retaliate, that his fists might rise in anger, but he didn't. He stood still, his silence louder than any punch could have been. The manager, blinded by arrogance, misread his restraint as weakness. He stepped closer, his hand pushing Shaq again. Harder this time. "I said leave," he barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Get out before I throw you out myself." The silence that followed was unbearable. Everyone waited, breath caught, to see what Shaq would do. His calmness in the face of humiliation unsettled even the employees. For the first time, some of them glanced nervously at each other, wondering if their manager had gone too far. Shaq slowly shook his head, his voice low but steady. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," but the manager only laughed cruelly. "The only mistake is letting you in, now get out." And with that, he shoved Shaq one last time, forcing him toward the exit. The glass doors swung open. The bright sunlight spilling into the showroom, Shaq stepped outside, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. His body was tense, his pride wounded, but his eyes carried something different now, a quiet fire. He didn't shout, didn't retaliate, didn't beg to be treated differently. Instead, he walked away with slow, deliberate steps, leaving behind a stunned crowd and an arrogant manager who believed he had won. But what no one in that showroom knew was that Shaq wasn't finished. His next move would not only change the fate of that dealership, but also shock every single person who had witnessed his humiliation. And this time, the manager would be the one standing in shame. The bright sunlight outside the glass doors spilled onto Big Shaq as he stood on the edge of the dealership's entrance. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath a battle to keep his composure. He had been shoved not once, not twice, but thrown out like he was nothing. The sting wasn't just in his body, it was in his pride. In his dignity, inside, the manager straightened his suit jacket, smirking like a man who believed he had won. His voice carried through the showroom, sharp and cruel. That's what happens when you step where you don't belong. You don't touch my cars, you don't waste my time. You're out, end of story. Some employees chuckled nervously. Afraid to defy their boss, others shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking between the manager and the door where Shaq stood. Customers whispered in disbelief. Phones still raised, capturing every second. The tension was electric. Shaq turned back slowly, his hand on the doorframe. His broad shoulders filled the space. His eyes locked on the manager, calm but blazing with quiet fire. He didn't move closer, he didn't need to. His silence alone unsettled the room, but the manager wasn't finished. His arrogance pushed him further. He stormed toward the entrance, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. His voice rose, echoing, "Didn't you hear me? I told you to leave completely." Before anyone could stop him, the manager shoved Shaq again, harder this time, forcing him backwards onto the sidewalk. The crowd gasped, sharp breaths filling the air like a chorus of shock. Shaq stumbled but caught himself standing firm. His jaw tightened, his fists curled at his sides, but he refused to strike back. The manager's face twisted with anger. His pride wouldn't let him stop. He stepped outside, his voice venomous. "You think you can walk in here, embarrass me in front of my staff and get away with it? I'll teach you a lesson." And then it happened. In a burst of arrogance and rage, the manager's fist flew forward. Landing against Shaq's chest, the sound was dull but heavy, echoing against the glass walls. The crowd inside gasped louder. Some screamed, "Oh my God!" Others raised their phones higher. Recording openly now, Shaq staggered back a step, his body absorbing the blow. His eyes flashed with fury for the first time. His breath came heavy. He could have retaliated, could have ended it in a single movement. He was big, strong and more than capable, but he didn't. His control was iron. Stronger than fists, the manager, fueled by his own arrogance, didn't stop there. He shoved Shaq again, his voice thundering. "Out! Get off my property before I drag you across the street myself." Shaq's chest burned, not just from the physical force, but from the insult, the humiliation. His dignity had been torn apart in front of strangers, in front of cameras, and yet he stood tall. His silence screamed louder than the manager's violence. Inside the showroom, whispers turned to outrage. A woman gasped to her husband, "He hit him!" "Did you see that? The manager actually hit him." An older man shook his head in disgust. "That's assault. Plain and simple." Employees looked at each other. Wide-eyed, some began muttering, "This has gone too far. He's crossed the line," but the manager didn't hear. Or maybe he didn't care, his pride was too loud. Drowning out the voices of reason, he stepped back into the doorway, straightening his tie, his lips curling into a satisfied smirk. "That'll teach you to stay in your place," he spat. Before turning his back on Shaq, Shaq stood in the sunlight. His body tense, his mind racing, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from the restraint it took not to react. His heart pounded like drums in his chest, each second stretched longer. Each stare from the crowd weighed heavier, but then something shifted. The customers who had been silent before now murmured louder. One young man near the glass said, "He didn't fight back once. He's taking all of this with dignity," another woman whispered. "The manager looks like the bully, not him." Phones continued to record, capturing not just the violence but the silence that followed. The image of a man holding himself steady against humiliation, refusing to strike back, was powerful. Shaq slowly exhaled, his eyes still locked on the manager's back. His voice, low but firm, cut through the murmurs. "You'll regret this." The words weren't shouted. They weren't threats, they were promises, calm and steady. The kind of words that carried weight, that made people stop and listen. The manager glanced back briefly, scoffing. "Regret? The only regret I'll have is letting you stay as long as you did." He waved his hand dismissively, like shooing away an insect. Then he disappeared back into the showroom. His arrogance filling every step. Shaq turned slowly, his face expressionless but his eyes burning with determination. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't demand justice then and there. Instead, he walked away, each step steady, deliberate. But as he disappeared down the street, the crowd inside the dealership buzzed louder. "This isn't over," someone muttered. "He'll come back," another whispered. The employees exchanged uneasy glances. The customers shook their heads in disbelief. The manager thought he had won, thought he had humiliated a man into silence. But what he didn't know, what no one there realized yet, was that Shaq's silence wasn't defeat. It was power, because his next move would not only shake the dealership to its core, it would stun every single person who had witnessed the arrogance, the violence and the disrespect of that moment. And when it came, the lesson would be unforgettable. The glass doors of the dealership slowly swung shut behind the manager, but the sound of what had just happened lingered in the air, like an echo no one could escape. The shove, the punch, the cruel words. They replayed in the minds of everyone who had seen it. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by hushed voices and the faint hum of cars outside. Customers stood frozen by the luxury vehicles they had come to admire. Some still held their phones in their hands, cameras open, screens glowing. A few had captured every second of the confrontation, from the insults to the final blow. Their fingers trembled slightly as they stopped the recordings, realizing they held something powerful in their hands. "Did he just hit him?" a woman whispered, her voice a mix of shock and disgust. She clutched her handbag tightly as though the violence might spill onto her. Her husband nodded grimly. "He did, and not just once. He pushed him out like he was trash." Near the back of the showroom, a young man shook his head as he replayed the video he had taken. The screen showed Big Shaq standing tall, refusing to fight back while the manager struck him. The young man muttered to his friend, "This is going online tonight. People need to see this. They need to see who's really the fool here." Employees whispered among themselves, their nervous voices barely above a murmur. Some looked pale, shifting from foot to foot. One of them said, "He crossed the line. I've seen him rude before, but this is too much," another added. "If this gets out, the dealership's reputation is finished." The atmosphere inside had changed moments earlier. The manager had strutted like a king in his castle, but now, the energy of the room was different, uncomfortable, judgmental, filled with unease. The staff avoided eye contact with customers. Customers avoided eye contact with staff. Everyone seemed to know that something irreversible had just taken place. Outside, Shaq stood on the sidewalk, breathing steadily. His broad shoulders rose and fell. His eyes were calm but sharp. He wasn't broken, he wasn't defeated. He stood like a man carrying more strength in silence than the manager had shown in all his shouting. A small group of people had gathered outside, passers-by drawn by the commotion inside the glass-walled showroom. They had seen Shaq stumble out, had heard the raised voice of the manager. A few of them whispered to each other, "That big guy didn't even fight back. He just stood there. Can you believe that?" Another shook his head. "And the manager? He looked like the bully, not the professional." The witnesses inside pressed closer to the windows. Some couldn't stop looking at Shaq standing so still, so composed after what had happened. His quiet presence unsettled them more than shouting ever could. It was the look of a man who wasn't done, a man who had more to say but chose to wait for the right moment. One of the customers, an older man in a gray suit, muttered under his breath, "I've worked in business my whole life, and let me tell you, humiliating a man in public like that always comes back around. That manager has no idea what he's just done." Inside, a young woman scrolled through her phone, already uploading the video she had taken. She typed quickly, "Luxury dealership manager attacks customer in broad daylight. Look who kept his cool." She hit post, and within seconds, notifications buzzed, likes, comments, shares. The video was already beginning to spread. The staff noticed. Their eyes widened as they realized the humiliation wasn't locked inside the showroom anymore. It was spilling out, leaking into the world beyond. A world where people judged even faster, Even harsher, meanwhile, Shaq finally turned his head, looking through the glass doors at the crowd inside. His expression was unreadable, calm, steady, almost patient. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms, didn't demand attention. But the weight of his stare made the employees shift nervously, made the customers murmur. The silence outside was broken when a young boy tugged at his mother's hand, pointing at Shaq. "Mama, why didn't he fight back?" he asked innocently. The mother knelt down, her eyes soft but proud. "Because, son, sometimes strength isn't in hitting back. It's in knowing when to stay calm." Those words rippled quietly among the people nearby. Some nodded slowly, realizing the truth of it. Shaq had been humiliated, disrespected, even hit, but he had not lowered himself to the manager's level. That restraint made him seem bigger, stronger, more in control. Inside, however, the manager poured himself a glass of water at the counter, shaking his head with smug satisfaction. "Problem solved," he muttered. "He won't be back." He had no idea the cameras were still rolling, no idea that his arrogance had already left the room in digital form, spreading to hundreds, soon thousands. For the crowd, though, the story wasn't over. They could feel it in the air. They could see it in the way Shaq stood outside. Tall and unshaken, they whispered to each other, "He's planning something. He's not done. You can tell by the way he's standing. He's waiting for the right time." And they were right. Because while the manager celebrated his shallow victory inside, Shaq was already planning his next move. A move that would not only shock the dealership, but also flip the entire story upside down. And when it came, it would leave everyone stunned. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Yet Big Shaq still stood outside the dealership, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but unreadable. People passing by glanced at him curiously, some recognizing him, some not. But everyone who had seen what happened inside knew one thing: Shaq wasn't leaving in defeat. Inside, the manager continued his day as if nothing had happened. He barked at employees, straightened his tie, and walked the floor like a conqueror. "Let's get back to real business," he announced smugly. "We don't have time to waste on jokers." His arrogance filled every corner of the showroom, but the employees whispered nervously behind his back. They had seen Shaq's silence, his patience, his calm after being disrespected. They had also seen the phones raised, the cameras recording. They knew the story wasn't over, and they were right. Because Shaq's next move was already in motion, he wasn't a man who reacted with fists. He was a man who reacted with impact. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. His voice was low, controlled, but firm. "Yeah. It happened again," he said quietly. "Send them down." "I want it handled today." Minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the dealership. The tinted windows rolled down, revealing a well-dressed man in a tailored suit. He stepped out confidently, the kind of confidence that came with power. Whispers spread among the crowd outside. "Who's that?" "He looks important." Shaq greeted him with a nod. The man clapped his shoulder firmly. "I saw the video already," he said, showing his phone screen where the clip of the manager's attack had already gone viral. Thousands of views piling up by the second. It's spreading fast. Together they walked toward the dealership doors. This time Shaq didn't enter alone, he entered with backup. And this wasn't the kind of backup the manager could intimidate. The glass doors swung open. The room fell silent as Shaq walked in again. Employees froze at their desks. Customers turned to stare. The manager looked up, his face twisting in disbelief. "You again?" he barked. "Didn't I throw you out already?" But before he could say more, the man in the suit stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Are you the manager here?" he asked. His tone carried no friendliness, only authority. The manager puffed his chest, trying to reassert control. "Yes, I am," he said arrogantly. "And this man has no business here. I already dealt with him." The suited man smirked slightly. "Oh, you dealt with him?" He pulled out a sleek leather folder, opening it to reveal official documents. "Because this man you call a nobody happens to be one of our largest investors. And today he came here with the intention of buying not one, but multiple cars." The manager's face drained of color. His smirk vanished instantly. That's not possible," he stammered. His arrogance cracked like glass under pressure. Shaq finally spoke, his voice steady, calm, but sharp. "I came here with respect," he said. "I gave you a chance to treat me like any other customer. Instead, you judged me, mocked me, humiliated me, and even hit me. All because of how I looked. All because you thought I didn't belong." The manager tried to recover, forcing a laugh that sounded weak. I didn't mean it like that. It was a misunderstanding," he stuttered, but Shaq stepped closer, his presence towering, his words cutting. "No," he said firmly, "you meant every word. You believed them, and now the whole world will see who you are. Because what you did wasn't just arrogance, it was prejudice. It was abuse of power." The suited man turned to the employees, his voice clear, effective immediately. "This manager is suspended pending investigation. His actions do not represent this brand, nor will they be tolerated." Shock rippled again. Employees exchanged glances. Some looked relieved, others nodded subtly. Customers whispered, recording everything. The downfall of the manager was unfolding before their eyes. The manager's face turned red, sweat beading on his forehead. "You can't do this to me," he shouted. But even as the words left his mouth, his voice cracked, his authority had collapsed. His arrogance had turned into desperation. Shaq didn't shout, didn't gloat, he simply stood tall, his silence more powerful than the manager's noise. Then he turned to the customers and employees, his voice calm but firm. "Let this be a lesson. Don't judge people by what they wear. Don't measure respect by appearances. Everyone deserves dignity." The words hit harder than any punch could. The crowd nodded, murmuring agreement. Some clapped quietly, their faces full of admiration. The manager, now humiliated, slumped back toward his office, his steps heavy. His reign of arrogance was over. The same crowd that once watched in silence now stared at him with contempt. Shaq turned to the suited man, nodded once, then looked back at the gleaming cars on the showroom floor. This time no one dared to stop him, no one dared to question him. He walked slowly between the rows of polished vehicles, his hands brushing against them with quiet pride. He wasn't just a customer anymore. He was the man who had flipped the story, and his next choice, to buy or to walk away, was his alone. The dealership had tried to throw him out, but Shaq had walked back in stronger than before, and his move had stunned them all. The dealership floor was quieter than it had ever been. The sound of footsteps echoed softly as Big Shaq moved slowly between the shining cars. The employees stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do, while customers whispered and held up their phones, recording everything. The arrogance of the manager had shattered, and the balance of power in the room had shifted. Shaq stopped near the black sports car that had first caught his eye when he entered hours earlier. He ran his palm gently across the hood again, but this time it wasn't just admiration, it was ownership. His silence had weight, his presence commanded attention. The suited man who had arrived with him cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "perhaps I should explain why we are here." He opened the leather folder again, pulling out a few papers. "This dealership doesn't seem to know who they tried to humiliate. Allow me to introduce properly. This is Mr. Shaquille Johnson, one of the largest shareholders in this dealership's parent company. He didn't just come here as a customer. He came here as part owner of the very business you work for." The words hit like thunder. Gasps rippled across the showroom. Employees blinked in disbelief. Customers whispered louder. "Shareholder? Part owner? Are you serious?" Phone zoomed in closer, capturing every word. The manager, standing near the counter, looked as if the ground had been pulled from under his feet. His mouth opened, then closed. He tried to speak, but no words came. His face turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The smirk that had once sat comfortably on his lips was gone, replaced by fear. Shaq finally spoke, his voice calm but sharp. "When I walked in here, I walked in as a man excited to buy a car. I walked in with respect, ready to do business, ready to support this dealership. But what I received was disrespect, arrogance, and even violence. And the only reason for that was because of how I looked." His words carried across the room like a blade cutting through silence. Customers nodded. Employees looked at their shoes in shame. The cameras recorded, capturing not just his words, but the steady conviction in his tone. Shaq continued, "You thought I was beneath you. You thought I couldn't afford even the cheapest car here. And because of that, you judged me, you mocked me, and you even hit me. But now you know the truth. You didn't just insult a customer. You insulted one of the very men who helped keep these doors open." The manager's knees weakened. He stuttered, I didn't know, I didn't realize." His voice cracked, but Shaq cut him off. You didn't care to know. That's the truth. You didn't ask my name. You didn't treat me with the basic respect any human being deserves. You looked at me, and you decided I didn't belong here. The room buzzed with murmurs. Customers shook their heads in disbelief. One older man whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." The tables turned just like that. A woman nearby muttered, "He deserved it." The way he treated him was disgusting. The suited man handed Shaq another document, a list of available cars reserved for top-tier clients. Shaq looked it over briefly, then placed it calmly on the hood of the car. His eyes returned to the manager. "You see, I didn't come here to prove myself," he said. "I don't need to prove anything. I came here because I wanted a car, that's it. But today, you reminded me of something bigger. That respect is priceless. And arrogance always costs more than you think." The employees exchanged nervous glances. Some looked ashamed. Others looked relieved that the truth had finally been revealed. Customers stood taller. Some even clapped softly. The sound of scattered applause filled the air, growing louder until the manager lowered his head in humiliation. Shaq stepped closer to him, his towering figure casting a shadow. "You thought throwing me out would end this, but instead you threw away your dignity, your reputation, and your authority in front of everyone. The videos of what you did are already spreading. The world will see your arrogance. The world will see the truth." The manager's lips trembled. "Please, I didn't mean to," he whispered. But Shaq raised his hand, stopping him. "Don't beg me now," he said firmly. "You had your chance to treat me right. You had your chance to show respect, but instead you chose arrogance. Now you'll live with the consequences." The crowd erupted again, this time with louder claps and nods of approval. Some cheered softly. "Well said. That's justice." The phones recorded every angle, every word, every crack in the manager's pride. Shaq turned to the suited man and said calmly, "Make sure this place remembers today." The suited man nodded, his pen already signing off on suspension papers, handing them to the stunned employees. The manager collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. His empire of arrogance had crumbled in minutes. Shaq walked back to the black sports car, running his hand along it one more time. He smiled faintly, not because he had won, but because he had made a point. He didn't need the car to prove his worth. The truth had already done that. As he turned to leave, he looked once more at the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "Remember this. Never judge a man by his clothes, his walk, or his silence. Judge him by his character, because one day, you may find that the person you dismiss is the very person who holds your future in his hands." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a dealership forever changed, a crowd stunned and a manager broken. The reveal was complete. The truth had shattered arrogance, and Shaq had proven that dignity always outshines pride. The story didn't end when Big Shaq walked out of the dealership doors. In fact, that was where it truly began. Because while the manager sat in his office, head in his hands, and employees whispered in stunned silence, the outside world was already buzzing. The videos recorded by customers and passers-by spread online like wildfire. Within hours, social media platforms were flooded with clips of the confrontation. Hashtags trended: "Respect matters," "Big Shaq story," "Arrogance exposed." People watched in disbelief as they saw a man walk in calmly, get insulted, shoved, even punched, and then walk away with a dignity that spoke louder than violence ever could. Comments poured in. Thousands of strangers shared their outrage at the manager's behavior. "This is disgusting," one wrote. "No customer deserves this," another said. "Shaq handled it better than anyone I know. That's real strength." The video wasn't just entertainment, it became a lesson, a mirror for people to see how arrogance destroys and humility uplifts. News outlets picked it up next. Local channels replayed the footage, anchors shaking their heads at the arrogance of the dealership. National media soon followed, calling it a powerful example of prejudice and power exposed in public. They highlighted Shaq's calm restraint, contrasting it with the manager's reckless violence. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about a car, it was about human dignity. Back at the dealership, business slowed. Customers canceled appointments, some even demanded refunds. Reviews online were filled with angry comments.